The conference room was silent except for the soft hum of the projector. I was mid-sentence explaining the final phase of the Nexus launch, a project I'd spent 3 years building, when David Sterling looked at me and smiled. Not a kind smile. The kind you give when you've already decided something. Your access is being revoked effective immediately, he said. His voice calm as if he were ordering coffee. You're no longer needed for this phase. I blinked. Once. My mouth went dry. Emily, I don't understand. The launch depends on. Thank you for your foundational work, he interrupted, that smile never wavering. We'll take it from here. The room didn't move. 20 people pretended to be very interested in their laptops. I felt the weight of their silence. This wasn't a conversation. It was an execution. Foundational work. I repeated quietly. I architected the entire compliance framework. He stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Security will escort you out. HR has the paperwork. As he walked past me, I caught something in his expression, a flicker of fear beneath that smile. But I didn't understand why. Not yet. What I would later realize was that David had already begun doubting his decision the moment he made it. That flicker of fear was the first crack in his certainty. The walk back to my desk felt like a funeral procession. The office buzzed with that particular energy when everyone knows something is wrong. Keyboards clicked louder. Conversations stopped when I passed. Miguel, the security guard, waited by my desk with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry about this, he mumbled. I packed my things into a cardboard box. My diplomas, my coffee mug, a photo of me at the project kickoff, smiling with genuine pride. All of it suddenly felt like evidence from a crime scene. Then HR appeared. Jessica from Human Resources, carrying a manila folder with legal weight. Here's your severance package and the transition memo, she said. I looked at the folder. I've never seen this before. It was sent to your email yesterday morning, she said, not meeting my eyes. Jessica, I received no email about this. She shifted uncomfortably. Well, it's standard procedure. You'll need to sign here. I didn't sign anything. 15 minutes later, I was on the street with a box in my hands and no idea why my career had just been executed. The afternoon sun felt too bright, too warm. Everything about the world seemed wrong now. My phone buzzed constantly. Texts from friends and former colleagues asking if I was okay. I didn't respond to any of them. I needed to think. I needed to understand what had just happened and why. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with 3 years of emails and files spread across the surface. I'm obsessive about documentation. Always have been. It saved me more times than I can count. I traced every major decision on Nexus. The framework I'd designed. The regulatory pathway I'd mapped. The compliance architecture I'd personally walked through with external auditors. Then I found it. A contract clause, buried in the Q3 documentation. Phase 2 initiation requires sign-off from the original framework architect. My sign-off. Not David. Not anyone else. Me. The CEO had just terminated the only person whose signature made the launch legally valid. The smile suddenly made sense. He thought he'd gotten away with it. But he'd made a critical error in his calculation. He assumed I was too proud, too angry, or too scared to think clearly about what I'd actually built. I pulled up the latest project timeline. Launch was in 6 weeks. He was going to need me whether he knew it yet or not. The company email landed in my inbox at 6 a.m. Excited to announce Victor Caldwell as Senior Director of Next Generation Strategy. I knew Victor. He was competent but had never led a project of Nexus's complexity. But that wasn't what made my chest tighten. The announcement included a quote from Victor. I'm honored to carry forward the integrated compliance framework that will define our industry's future. That was my exact language. From my internal presentation. Word for word. I pulled up his resume, his LinkedIn, his public statements. He'd positioned himself as the architect of something he hadn't built. And David had let him. David had handed him credit for my 3 years of work. The rage was sharp and cold. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns fast. The kind that burns for a long time. The kind that focuses you. I sat very still and did something I'd never done before. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't send an angry email. I opened a new document and wrote the title, Everything They Don't Know. By Thursday, the narrative had spread like a disease through the office. Emily's work was solid, but she was hard to work with. I overheard in the bathroom. My former colleague, Thomas, reached out that afternoon. I heard David saying your execution was the problem, not your strategy. He's telling people you were too rigid to adapt. Did he say that to the board? Yes, probably. He's been vocal about it. David had positioned my termination as a performance issue rather than a business decision. It made him look decisive. It made me look unreliable. I thanked Thomas and hung up, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't about being fired anymore. It was about being erased from the narrative entirely. The systematic removal of my name, my contributions, my very presence from the company's story was designed to make me powerless. But David didn't understand that erasing someone from the narrative also erased their obligation to help. I made a decision that seemed crazy. I did nothing. No angry calls to lawyers. No LinkedIn posts. No warnings to former colleagues. No attempts to defend myself. Complete silence. My mother called constantly. You should fight this, she urged. Your reputation. Mom, sometimes the loudest thing you can do is be quiet, I said. Something told me that fighting back directly would play into what David wanted. He wanted me to be the angry woman he'd already told people I was. So I became someone else entirely. Someone patient. Someone strategic. I took my time, went to the gym, saw friends, applied for consulting positions. I let 3 weeks pass where David probably felt relieved. The pressure was off. The problem was solved. He could move forward. That was when the email came. A recruiter named Paul reached out. We're aware of your recent transition. We're building something revolutionary and need someone with your exact skill set. Interested? I'd never posted about being available. I agreed to a coffee meeting. The waiting was over. Now came the building. Over the next week I did something methodical. I mapped every single dependency in the Nexus launch. Not from memory. From the infrastructure itself. From code comments. From email threads. From every piece of digital debris that documented what I'd built. I created a visual diagram. Red lines connecting every decision, every validation point, every critical moment that required authorization. At the center, binding everything together, was one unassailable truth. The Phase 2 certification required the signature of the original framework architect. That was me. There was no workaround. No delegation. No way to fake it without invalidating the entire regulatory chain. I designed it that way intentionally. David had either forgotten this requirement or assumed he could intimidate me into signing off retroactively. I saved the diagram in a folder on my personal cloud drive and labeled it Insurance. Then I waited. Patiently. My sister called on a Wednesday. Mom's worried you're becoming obsessed with this. She thinks you need to move on. I am moving on, I said. She doesn't believe you. She said you've been weird. I wasn't different. I was finally clear about something I'd been running from my whole life. The fact that I had power, and I'd never learned how to use it properly. For 3 years, I'd built Nexus and handed it over to people who didn't understand it. I'd been humble, helpful, and they'd cut me off the moment I wasn't useful. Tell Mom I'm fine, I said. Tell her I'm better than I've been in years. You're scaring me a little, she admitted. Good, I said. You should all be aware that silence isn't weakness. Silence is preparation. After I hung up, I realized something important. My family's discomfort was exactly the kind of social pressure that kept people like me compliant. It was a beautiful trap, wrapped in love and concern. I turned off my phone and went back to work. The invitation came on a Friday. External partners briefing, pre-launch alignment session. I wasn't invited. But Paul from the recruiting firm had just become a strategic partner for David's company. and Paul forwarded me the agenda. I read through it carefully, looking for one thing: the risk assessment. It wasn't there. The Nexus launch involved regulatory compliance, customer data, financial transactions. And there was no formal risk assessment in the pre-launch briefing. Someone had either forgotten to include it or deliberately omitted it. That was a problem. I drafted an email to Paul. I noticed the briefing agenda doesn't include a risk assessment component. Why not? He responded within minutes. I noticed the same thing. How would you handle it if you were still involved? I asked. Who would need to certify that a risk assessment was completed? There was a long pause. The original architect, he replied. The trap was already set. I reached out to the Advisory Board of Technology Leaders, a respected industry group specializing in evaluating compliance frameworks for complex launches. I presented the Nexus framework to them, the architecture, the dependencies, the regulatory requirements. I asked, what am I missing? They reviewed everything for 3 hours. My palms were sweating as they worked, but I kept my face calm. Then the lead advisor, Catherine, looked at me with an unreadable expression. Who signed off on the risk assessment? She asked. There hasn't been a formal one yet, I said carefully. There has to be, Catherine said. This level of regulatory complexity requires certification from someone with comprehensive knowledge of the entire system. And if the original architect is no longer employed? Catherine's eyes narrowed. Then you have a serious problem. Nobody's going to sign off on something they don't fully understand. A pause. Who is the original architect? I smiled. The same smile David had given me when he thought he was winning. That would be me, I said. The room went very quiet. The launch date was locked. Press releases were scheduled. Investor presentations were booked. David was committed publicly, which meant he couldn't delay without losing credibility. Meanwhile, my name was being systematically erased from company documentation. I found it when Paul sent me updated project materials. Every reference to my work had been reframed as previous phase strategy, or foundational efforts by prior team members. My name appeared nowhere. It was brilliant, actually. They were acknowledging good work while making sure nobody associated it with me. The problem was that erasure created a gap. If nobody could point to who'd actually built the system, nobody could certify that it was built correctly. And if the system couldn't be certified, it couldn't launch. I documented every instance of erasure. Every email where my work was referenced but my name removed. Every presentation where my framework appeared without attribution. I wasn't going to use this information to complain. I was going to use it to prove they couldn't launch without me. I accepted a position at a mid-size consulting firm. Interesting work. Fair pay. No drama. What they didn't know was that they had a partnership agreement with my old company. A strategic collaboration on emerging technology standards. So I was technically still connected to David's world, but from a distance. I had visibility into their decisions without being implicated in them. I was a ghost in the system. Present but invisible. Watching. Waiting. During my second week, I was invited to a meeting between our firm and David's company. A strategic alignment session. I told my manager I'd attend. He seemed surprised that I wanted to go. That was when I really began. That was when all the preparation started turning into action. David looked directly at me during the meeting and nodded politely. The way you acknowledge a stranger. He had no idea I'd ever worked at his company. The meeting was about Nexus. About timeline confirmations and launch readiness. Everything's on track, David said confidently. We're ready for deployment. I said nothing. Just listened. I was the observer gathering intelligence. 20 minutes later, David sent an email to his team. He copied the wrong person, someone from our firm sitting next to me. In that email he wrote, "Need to confirm. Has anyone actually done the risk certification, or are we just assuming Victor completed it? If not, we need someone to sign off ASAP, even if it's just a formality. Can't launch without it." The email was forwarded to me within minutes. My hands actually shook when I read it. David had just revealed the entire problem in writing. He knew he needed certification. He was counting on bureaucracy and carelessness to save him. That was when I understood his complete miscalculation. He thought I was gone. He thought I was irrelevant. He was so wrong. That email became the foundation of everything that followed. I forwarded it to Catherine at the advisory board. Does this align with standard pre-launch procedure? Catherine's response was immediate. This is negligent. They're attempting to launch a regulated system without proper certification. This is a compliance violation. Pause. Are you willing to document this formally? I told her I would think about it. But I was already thinking about everything. Then I contacted the external auditing firm that had originally validated the Nexus framework. I scheduled a call, framed as a general consultation. During the call, I mentioned casually, I'm curious how you'd handle a situation where a company wanted to launch a regulated system without completing the required risk assessment. The auditor, Richard, went quiet for a very long time. They can't, he said finally. It's not optional. If they launch without certification, they're violating their compliance agreement with regulators. And if the original architect was no longer with the company, then they'd need to bring them back or they'd delay everything. You can't just skip a step that critical. I thanked him and hung up, feeling something crystallize inside me. Now I had 3 independent sources confirming the same truth. David had a problem he couldn't solve without me. The delay happened on a Thursday. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet internal announcement that the launch had been pushed back 2 weeks for final optimization. But I knew the real reason. Someone in David's organization had finally done the math and realized they didn't have certification. The stock market noticed immediately. Nexus had been positioned as a huge growth driver. Now suddenly there was a delay with no explanation. During a board call I heard about through Paul, someone asked directly, "Why are we delaying? What's the real issue?" David's answer was vague. Final technical validation. We want to make sure everything's perfect before we deploy at scale. But the real answer was, we lost the person who validates everything, and we didn't think we'd need them. That silence, that inability to explain the true reason, was going to become his biggest problem. David did a public appearance on a Wednesday. An investor conference call where he was supposed to reassure stakeholders. I listened to the recording afterward. I listened to it 3 times. He talked about the quality of the team, the strength of the framework, the importance of getting things right. But he sounded uncertain. For the first time, his voice lacked the confidence that had characterized every earlier conversation. We're working with external partners to ensure our standards are as robust as possible, he said. Translation. We're scrambling to find someone who will sign off on this. A question came from an analyst. Can you speak to who's responsible for certification on this project? David paused. Long enough that people started to wonder if there'd been a technical glitch. We have a comprehensive team approach to validation, he finally said. Translation. We don't have a single person who can take responsibility. After the call, I sent an email to Catherine. I'm ready to document everything formally. The discovery happened quietly, in a spreadsheet. Someone at David's company was doing a final checklist for launch requirements. And they realized that one signature line on the Phase 2 certification form had never been filled in. The signature of the original framework architect. They couldn't forge it. They couldn't delegate it to someone else. They couldn't manufacture it retroactively. They could only do one thing, acknowledge it was missing. And once they acknowledged it was missing, everything changed. A missing signature on a compliance document is the same as admitting you never actually completed compliance. I heard about this discovery because Paul got a call from someone panicked at David's company asking if there was any way to contact me. Paul didn't give them my contact information. Instead, he told me, "They know they need you. They're desperate now." The trap was about to close. I was at my desk on Friday morning when my phone rang. Unknown number. It was an executive from David's company. Not David himself, but someone from the board. "Emily," he said carefully, We need to discuss something. Of course, I said, my voice calm and professional. We realize there was some miscommunication when you transitioned out of your previous role. We'd like to have a conversation about how we might remedy that. Remedy? As if I'd made an error. I'm listening, I said. Would you be willing to meet? Just informally. To clarify some technical aspects of the Nexus framework. What kind of clarification? Yes. There was a pause. He was choosing his words carefully. Certification clarification, he said finally. I didn't respond immediately. I let him sit in that silence. Let him understand that he was now dependent on my goodwill. I might be available, I said. Though I should mention I'm consulting for another firm that has a partnership with your company. That might create complexity. We could structure it as a technical consultation, he offered. Neutral ground. Professional rates. I'd want to see the requirements first, I said. Everything you need validated. We can send those over immediately, he said. Could you meet Monday? I could, I said. But I'll need to involve an independent auditor in any certification work. After we hung up, I sat very still. They were going to come to me. On my terms. Officially. Monday's meeting happened in a conference room at a neutral location. A law firm specializing in technology consulting. Very official. Very documented. David wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. Instead it was the board executive, Victor, and 2 lawyers. I brought Catherine from the advisory board and Jonathan, the external auditor. We'd like to engage your services to complete the framework certification, the board executive said formally. I'd need to understand the current state of the system first, I said. I'll need to review what's been done since I left, what's been changed. What followed was 3 hours of technical review. My coffee went cold. My notes filled pages. And what I discovered was that they'd made exactly the kind of changes I'd feared. Victor had modified critical components without understanding the dependencies. Things that worked before now had subtle errors. Nothing catastrophic. But under regulatory scrutiny, they'd fail immediately. These modifications need to be reverted, I said calmly. And then we need a complete revalidation. Victor's face went pale. How long will that take? He asked quietly. 3 days if you revert the changes and document them properly. And if we don't revert them, he asked. Then you don't launch. Because I won't certify them, and without certification, regulators won't approve deployment. I let that sink in. The lawyers leaned over and whispered to the board executive. We'll revert them, he said finally. Good, I said. I'll need a formal request in writing. He nodded slowly. And I'll need to submit my findings officially to the regulatory board, as is standard for certification of this magnitude. His expression changed completely. He understood what that meant. That's going to be complicated, he said. For you maybe, I said. Not for me. What happened next moved very fast. Board members started asking hard questions. Questions about why the original architect had been terminated. Questions about why the replacement had made unauthorized changes. David tried to control the narrative. He had a meeting with the board where he explained that my termination was about performance. But now people had documents. They had the timeline. They had the emails where he'd discussed needing certification and hoping someone would just sign off. They had evidence that my departure had been retribution. And they had me submitting formal documentation that made it very clear who had built the system and who had broken it. One board member actually said, "Why did we fire the only person who understood this system?" David's response was, "It was the right call at the time." But nobody believed him anymore. By Wednesday, the board was meeting privately. Without David. That's when you know it's really over. Friday brought the official announcement. Nexus was being delayed indefinitely for comprehensive system optimization and stakeholder coordination. No date was given. The stock fell 12%. Analysts started asking questions. Questions about management. Questions about risk oversight. Questions David couldn't answer without admitting the truth. And the truth was starting to come out. Piece by piece. Document by document. A reporter from a technology publication reached out to me. They'd heard rumors about what had really happened. Said no. Not yet. I didn't need to be the one telling the story. What I did do was make sure that Catherine, Jonathan, and the regulatory bodies all had complete information. The paper trail was everything. And David was drowning in it. The whispers started Monday morning. David had been spotted in meetings with lawyers. He'd taken personal calls that made him leave looking shaken. He was no longer attending public events. By Wednesday, the rumor was official. David was resigning. Not fired. Resigned. Which allowed him to maintain some dignity. He'd scheduled an emergency meeting with the company. I heard about it through Paul. It was a goodbye meeting. David explaining that he was stepping down to pursue other opportunities. What he didn't say was that he was leaving because the company had discovered he'd fired the only person who could save the biggest project in company history. He left on a Thursday. Effective immediately. Within days, the new CEO, someone brought in from outside, started making changes. Victor was reassigned to a different division. The modifications he'd made were documented as experimental implementations that required further refinement. The company issued a statement acknowledging that the Nexus certification process had involved multiple stakeholders with varying levels of framework expertise. And me. I was offered a position on the company's technical oversight board. A senior advisory role with significant compensation and equity. I declined it. Professionally, respectfully, but clearly. I appreciate the offer, I wrote. But I've built something important where I am now. I'm not interested in returning. What I am interested in is ensuring the Nexus project launches successfully. So I agreed to serve as an external consultant. Not an employee. Independent. Which meant I had all the authority and none of the liability. 6 months later, Nexus launched successfully. The launch event was huge. Press coverage was massive. The project was considered a breakthrough. And in every official document, in every regulatory filing, my name was listed as the original framework architect. There was no ambiguity. No erasure. The work was credited correctly. By that point, I'd built my consulting practice into something real. 3 other clients. A team of 2 additional consultants. Offers coming in constantly. The funny part was that some companies had tried to hire Victor afterward. None of them had kept him long. He was competent but not exceptional. Real talent isn't erasable. Not permanently. One afternoon I got a message from Paul. David got a job at a startup. Middle management. Significantly less visible than before. I nodded and moved on. A year after the Nexus launch, I was invited to speak at a technology conference about building scalable systems and managing complex project transitions. I almost declined. I didn't want to be known as the woman who got revenge on her boss. But the organizers explained they wanted me specifically because I represented something important. Someone who understood that power isn't about volume. It's about being the only person who understands how everything works. So I gave the talk. I didn't mention David by name. I talked about frameworks and dependencies and why documentation matters. I talked about becoming essential by being genuinely exceptional, and then leveraging that when people take you for granted. In the audience was a young woman, probably early in her career, who came up afterward with tears in her eyes. I just got demoted for speaking up about a problem, she said. Everyone's treating me like the difficult one. What should I do? I thought about David's smile. About those 3 years of work. About the moment when he realized his miscalculation. Document everything, I said. Make yourself the only person who truly understands the system. Then wait for them to realize they need you. When they do, negotiate from a position of knowledge, not anger. Don't broadcast your strength. Let them discover it through their own desperation. She nodded, understanding something I'd had to learn the hard way. I ran into David 6 months ago at a conference. He was giving a talk on leadership resilience to a half-empty room. His startup had failed. He'd taken a position as chief operations officer at a mid-sized firm. Respectable, but a far cry from running his own company. When he saw me, his face went pale. For a moment, I saw that same flicker of fear from the conference room, but older now. Worn down. He approached me during a break. "Emily," he said carefully. "I've wanted to apologize for a long time." Waited. I didn't make it easy for him. "I made a terrible mistake," he continued. "I should have recognized what you were to that project. What you meant to the company." "Yes," I said simply. "You should have." "I've thought about it every day since," he said. "I've learned a lot about what real leadership looks like." I believed him. Not because his words were perfect, but because failure had given him clarity. That's the thing about power. Sometimes you don't understand its value until you've lost it. "I'm glad," I said. "That matters." He nodded and walked away. I never heard from him again. Some people smile while cutting you off, thinking they've won. They don't understand what you've actually built. They can't imagine a world where the person they just dismissed has any power left. But the most dangerous moment is when that smile fades. When they realize you weren't irrelevant. You were essential. And now you're simply expensive. The real victory isn't in proving you were right. It's in building something so foundational that the people who dismissed you have no choice but to understand your value. And sometimes, if they're truly capable of growth, understanding comes with genuine remorse. That's when you know your power was never about revenge. It was always about building something that couldn't be broken.